All right, recognizing the House Leader for the third party.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to ask a few questions here this afternoon. Jobs, economic development, and innovation. The Island Coastal Economic Trust has generated more than $300 million worth of economic development for Vancouver Island, Sunshine Coast, and Great Bear coastal communities. The proposal that was submitted by the ICET, as it's known, last fall, included a recapitalized $150 million fund that would generate, as part of their business case, an estimated $1 billion of investment for those communities. Considering the BC NDP government had several $billion surplus prior to the new fiscal year available to them to recapitalize this fund, I'd just like to get a sense from the Minister what, from the Minister's perspective, this says about the priority, the fact that the fund was not recapitalized, the fact that it was given a $10 million Band-Aid instead of actually the funds that were requested. What does it say about the priority for Vancouver Island, Sunshine Coast, and Great Bear communities for this government?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the member and the representative of the third party for the question. I do want to first correct some language that the member has chosen to use, recapitalization at $150 million. ICET has never been capitalized at $150 million. ICET was created in 2006. It was capitalized at $50 million at that time. And our government recapitalized them, if you want to use that language, at $10 million in 2018. We've made a commitment of an additional $10 million in this budget, or pardon me, using year-end funds. That's subject to the technicality of having that legislation change. But that capitalization level is very consistent with the amount that this organization has spent over time. And we highly value the work that this organization has done. They've done great work at that level of capitalization. And in fact, this is very consistent and does support the important work they're doing on Vancouver Island. I want to point out, though, that that certainly isn't the only work that we're prioritizing. While important, there are additional inputs that we're providing for rural economic development and to Vancouver Island in particular. Some of the money that you referenced to our year-end funding was dispersed through a growth fund. $1 billion was dispersed. And I'll share with the member that $116,576,000 went to Vancouver Island in that disbursement. So that's an important input as well. And that funding allows for infrastructure projects to occur. It's very important funding. We also have a program called the Regional Economic Development and Infrastructure Program, different than specifically the ICET program, but they can work in parallel. The REDIT program was originally funded at $33 million, but in fact the quality of applications, and a number of which came from the riding that the member references, the applicants for this were so high quality, and we received many, many applications. And so we, in fact, went back to Treasury and were able to double the amount of funding from $33 million to $66 million. and we are now dispersing that funding to over 200 organizations across our province that are doing truly excellent work in regional economic development. And I particularly like this program because, quite similar to the work that RADIP and the other granting organizations do, is that it's very much based on what communities are asking for. The program was designed to be quite broad, so there's a range of opportunities, and applicants can be municipalities, regional governments, First Nation governments, or nonprofits to apply for that funding. So not to suggest it somehow displaces the excellent work being done by ICET, but it's another opportunity for municipalities and First Nations communities to receive funding for, again, infrastructure and economic development work. We've also created a BC Jobs Manufacturing Fund. It was originally funded at $90 million and specifically geared towards the regions, although we realized that the integrated nature of manufacturing and forestry was such that we needed to fund it in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island as well. So that's now funded at $180 million. And that funding is geared both towards the forestry sector in one aspect, but also manufacturing more generally. And different than the RADIP funding, but working in parallel, this particular pool of funding can be applied for directly from the private sector. So it's businesses that apply for this funding. It can provide 20% of a project for increased manufacturing up to a level of $10 million. And so to give a sense of the kind of project we might see coming forward from the Manufacturing Jobs Fund, if a forestry company, for example, and we know that we've seen some curtailment in mills, if a forestry company wanted to move into value add, which is something we're certainly encouraging, they can use this funding to refit one of their lines. So, for example, in Crofton on Vancouver Island, a similar funding opportunity was available, and Crofton had closed their third line. We were able to provide some funding and to leverage federal funding, so they refit that line to do value add. And now what they're doing instead of pulp and paper is creating wooden utensils for restaurants, displacing single-use plastics. The great news about that story, and the reason I share it as an example of what the Jobs Manufacturing Fund can do, is that all 100 workers that lost their job due to that mill curtailment, every single one of them came back to work with that redesign. So we're feeling very hopeful about the Jobs Manufacturing Plan. We're hoping it's going to be used in that way in other communities, but also that it can drive manufacturing into a number of different areas. We also have a tourism destination development fund and the Community Workforce Response Grant. So there are a number of different ways that we're driving economic activity, and an important one of them is ICET.
Member.
Thank you. And actually, I'm disappointed that with this response. The reality is that the ICET served a particular function, and I think the minister knows that the ICET serves a particular function, and that is to be able to deal to fund community-driven projects. The offerings that have been put out there as a kind of replacement are indeed not a replacement for the ICET. The ICET is geographically located. It has a geographic boundary to it. These funds that have been offered as solutions are available to every other region in the province. That includes regions that have access to permanent community-driven decision-making funds that have been proposed by, and we went through this in question period. They're not the same thing. They're different things. So you can't, the minister is correct that there never was $150 million. The fund was created as a sinking fund, and what was requested by the ICET was to create a permanent fund that could be locked in, that then the board that has been making these decisions over time could make decisions on behalf of their communities. The $1 billion that the minister highlighted, 160 of which goes to Vancouver Island communities, those are also funds that are available to every other municipality and regional district in the province that also has a very viable community economic development trust. It's not the same. It's different. This government has singled out communities that it represents and chosen to put a Band-Aid solution in place rather than to actually, at a time when we had economic capacity to make this investment, where the principal never gets touched, and all that happens is we take the investment on an annual basis and invest what's there for us. These are not the same thing. And it's really unfortunate to have the minister try to bring these two different situations together and act like what is being offered is the same. It's not. There's an advantage that the other communities in this province have that now Vancouver Island, coastal communities and communities on the coast here don't have access to a fund. This is still going to be a sinking fund. It is still going to be a situation where they're looking in a couple of years to be able to a government, whichever government it is, to invest and make that permanent investment. We had that opportunity. The economic forecast, as I think everybody, including the Minister of Finance, has talked about, is not what it was when we had billions of dollars in front of us, and this government decided, for whatever reason it is, that it's not going to recapitalize it. The vision that was put forward by the ICET was, quote, a vision to fully engage the First Nations and local governments in co-governance of a regional economic development organization. It will be the first in Canada. While our current legislation offers no opportunity for First Nations governments to participate in the fund's decision-making, transformational changes to our governance structure will empower First Nations to self-determine, to be full and equal participants in the Trust's decision-making, creating a new three-way partnership between First Nations, local governments, and the province. Does the Minister support the co-governance model that was put forward by the ICET?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to share with the member that ministry staff are working closely with all three trusts to develop a governance model that includes Indigenous people. And in fact, this is one of the Ministry's Declaration Act action plan items, and that work is underway not just with ICET but with all three of the trusts. I do also want to for the record, state the funding that's gone into the trusts. In 2005-2006, the Northern Development Initiatives Trust, the Economic Trust of the Southern Interior, and the Island Coastal Economic Trust were each capitalized at $50 million. In 2017-2018, ICET received an additional $10 million. And I think, as the member knows, this fall we're introducing legislative amendments granting $30 million to the three trusts, the Island Coastal Economic Trust, the Northern Development Initiative Trust, and the Economic Trust of the Southern Interior.
Member.
Thank you, and thank you to the Minister for the response. I appreciate that the Minister's working to develop a co-governance or to be including First Nations into the decision-making. I would, I think, I was going to ask about the Minister's perspective, because there's a couple of other pieces that were highlighted in the application or into the proposal that was submitted to the provincial government last September. They included environmental, social, and governance strategy, inclusive of Indigenous rights, to create an investment strategy that not only considers ESG plus IR factors in the community, but also strives to be a leader in Canada, as well as adopting a well-being impact framework that could be used, be the first for trusts in British Columbia, but also focus on strengthening well-being across the coastal region. I think one of the things that I've heard is that the other trusts in the province have been and have access to significantly more capital than the Island Coastal Economic Trust, and the situation that was created in 2005-2006 is what it is. The reality that the Island Coastal Economic Trust faces now, as it was established as a sinking fund, is that it needed the provincial government to see the vision that the small capital grants that were being offered, the community placemaking grants that were offered, the community economic development, the grants are to prepare applications and proposals for larger projects. Those small grants that were being funded by the Island Coastal Economic Trust, none of those are going to be funded by the community funds that were given to the municipalities that were offered as a potential solution. None of those projects are going to be funded by the REDIP. None of those projects are going to be funded by the manufacturing fund. Perhaps maybe some of the projects that the ICET has funded over the past few years might be qualifying under the tourism destination fund. The key question here is that with about $5 billion of a surplus budget available to be voted on a few weeks back, this provincial government made a decision that the Island Coastal Economic Trust did not show value to those communities and was not valuable enough to be reinvested in. Why was that determination made, even after all of the successes that have been outlined, the thorough plan that was put in place, the business case that was given to the government? The history is what it is. The decision was before the minister to invest in these communities, and the minister made the decision not to. Why did this government not make those targeted investments in those, community theaters, outdoor theaters, welcome figures to let people know where they are and the places? The Cortez Commercial Commons. Which one of the funds that the minister pointed out, where in the provincial government is there going to be a few $1,000s to encourage and to support the Cortez Island community to develop a commercial commons like the Island Coastal Economic Trust was so aptly able to do.
Minister.
Thank you. There's no question that the work that ICET has done is impactful and important. And they've shared information with us that they've been able to take the $50 million and then the $10 million that they received and have $300 million worth of impact. Those are the numbers that they've shared with us. That $60 million was dispersed over 18 years. The funding that we are providing, the $10 million that we're providing, subject to legislative change, is very consistent with the funding that they have had. We are supporting their ongoing and continued excellent work. And using the ratio that they themselves have provided, that's a factor of 5 that they've been able to leverage in order to do the excellent economic development work that they've done. So it's my expectation that they'll continue that excellent work, and that $10 million will in fact probably see $50 million worth of economic activity.
Member.
Of course, the opportunity that the minister had was to create provide enough resources that a permanent fund could be created, so that then that organization, those communities, would not be coming back to a future government in whatever economic landscape that future government was existing in. I think what the local elected officials are so deeply frustrated about, and were expressing their frustration to me at the Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities Convention this weekend, was that this government missed a golden opportunity with a surplus to provide a permanent resource for those communities so that they didn't have to consistently be coming back to the provincial government and asking for money. And as someone who was formerly in local government, I know what that relationship feels like between the local and provincial governments, where the money that's allocated to the municipal governments from the provinces is a gift from the province's perspective, but it's an absolute need from the local government's perspective. And it's a very unhealthy relationship. And so I think what I'm hearing the local government, local leaders, the people who have benefited from that project, was that this government missed a golden opportunity to take that surplus that we spent the first couple of weeks in this spring session allocating. This ministry, because it's over a couple of ministers, it's not entirely the situation on the current minister, it's also the situation that the former minister, who was the one that received the project, failed to deliver that permanence that local communities saw the opportunity to create, failed to embrace the well-being framework that was put in place, failed to embrace the co-governance proposals that were put in place, failed to embrace the environmental, social, and governance framework that was put into place. Let it get to a situation where then, yes, the minister can very well state that this is the ratio that they have been drawing their funds down at. But that's not what the proposal suggested. The proposal suggested was that they didn't want to have to continue to come back and ask the province for more money, especially in a time when there was an opportunity to make that permanent investment. Why did the minister choose to keep this organization kind of in a cap-in-hand relationship with the provincial government, rather than creating and providing enough resources to create a permanent fund where they did not have to be continually coming back to the province every few years?
Minister.
I think the member and I agree that ICET is a very important organization. We disagree a little bit on the percentage and type of funding, but there's no question that they're an important organization. They're one way that we do economic development and local funding, but there are other ways as well. And they don't have to compete, they can work together. It doesn't mean that we don't fund the projects that are important to the island. And you highlighted a project that you, I think, consider very important, and I would agree with you, which is the Cortes Island Village Common. Well, I'll share with the member that that was funded at $495,795 by our Reddit program. So there's more than one way that we can support the really important economic development work that needs to happen in your region and, frankly, throughout British Columbia. I'll also share with you, just to address the comment that the member has made that there's a sense that somehow there's an unequal distribution of funding to Vancouver Island. I would counter that, in fact, and say, just to look at the Reddit funding, the regional distribution of that funding, a full 21.5 million went to Vancouver Island and the coast. 49 projects were funded, and that's a full 33% of the Reddit funding. And again, I'm not suggesting this takes the place of the excellent work that's being done by ICET, but there are many ways that we can provide this funding. And the island is deeply important to us, and that's why we're making sure that economic development continues to happen.
Member.
Thank you. Well, I think, again, I think that the key point here is that the fundamental difference between the ICET and the Reddit funding is that the Reddit funding requests go to the provincial government. The Island Coastal Economic Trust requests go to community members who make those community-driven decisions. It's a fundamental, it's a key difference. And I think that the percentage, and I have to think a little bit more on the population, but I think that the Reddit funding, that's not something to be necessarily taking a victory lap on. That's, I think, a reflection of the population breakdown of our province. The southern Vancouver Island and coastal communities make up at least a third of our economy. So that sounds like it's about right. The problem is, of course, is that that is replacing what was once a fund that was able to provide robust funds. The projects, if you take a look at the projects that were funded early on in the ICET, they were much larger. There was much greater capacity. Over the past few years, they've become much, much smaller grants in order to be able to stretch the money out. The difference that we're talking about here, of course, is $10 million that the provincial government stepped up with at the end of this last fiscal. The proposal that was put in place in front of the ministry last fall was to generate between $7 to $12 million annually to be redistributed. The principle of that fund never to be touched. So I just simply will not accept that it's an equal, that there's some equity in here. The amount of funding that was provided one time in a sinking fund by the provincial government was what the proposal of the ICET was to generate on an annual basis. It was right in the middle. It was kind of the median of what they were expecting the investment to be able to turn over. So these are not equal things that are being offered here. And that is what is so frustrating. And I think clearly that has and the minister and the government can say that the Vancouver Island and the coastal communities are an important region for the province, but the actions around the Ministry of Transportation's decisions around the ENN rail corridor, the decisions that have been made around the ICET are a clear indication otherwise. And so I don't think we're going to make any further headway. I'll just leave it at that, and I thank the minister for her responses.